get started. First, a few words about the required work in this course. There is a take-home midterm examination. This is going to be arranged primarily for my personal convenience. What I mean by that is that on November 18th, I will not be in class because I have to go to a conference in California. So it seemed to me that that week would be a good week for you to write your take-home midterm examination, which means that the topic or choice of topics will be handed out probably on the 16th, and you'll be given a week to compose a response, and that would make the response due the following Tuesday, which I think is the 23rd. That is also, of course, just before Thanksgiving, but since you'll be able to submit it by email if you don't have a hard copy in class, for those of you who believe Thanksgiving should be a week or 10-day holiday in Guatemala or something, we can accommodate that. With respect to the two brief papers, the teaching assistants in this course, the section supervisors, they are going to select topics, and they are going to assign these to fit their personal schedules when they want to read and evaluate these topics. But the second paper will be due at the very end of the course, more or less at the time of the last lecture. Then there will be a take-home final examination, which will be due at the time of what would be the regularly scheduled date for the final examination. The reason for this is because grades are expected to be submitted within a certain amount of time after the final examination. It is not impossible to get extensions on these things. I have never thought highly of professors who chop off limbs or make other corporal punishments for being late with work. I miss deadlines with distressing frequency. On the other hand, it's extremely unwise to put things off unless you absolutely have to, simply because the buildup becomes too great, and also because there's a psychological phenomenon that you might not yet recognize because you have been too diligent thus far in your careers, but it takes the form of a curve of anxiety, so that as you get nearer and nearer a deadline, your anxiety increases. It goes up and up. Now you've missed the deadline. Your anxiety increases. It gets worse and worse, and then it goes down because you reach a sort of, well, what the hell phase. And the paper that you thought was going to be in 2 days late comes in 3 months late. And ride the curve. If you're going to be a bit late, just be a bit late while you're still being driven by that inner demon, because it's going to lose energy real fast once you've become hopelessly behind. All right, now. Today I'm going to talk about a topic that really is relevant to several different chapters of the book and is discussed explicitly in a sort of historiographical essay that occurs on pages 305 to 307, which you have not yet had assigned, and whenever you get around to reading the essay, you will see that it is a very summary form of what I'm going to lecture on today. The reason I'm lecturing on it today is because it picks up from what I was talking about at the very end of the last lecture, and that is the interesting phenomenon of Buddhism and Christianity taking root and having remarkable success in these two empires, if we want to use that term, Rome and Han China, and having that success bridge the period of the decline and disappearance of the empire. In other words, it's not something that coincides with the empire, but rather something that grows in its later stages, raising the question of the degree to which the political environment is an operative factor here. The example that will arise more explicitly later on will be with the rise of Islam. Buddhism, Christianity, and Islam are recognized as the three great proselytizing religions in the world, and ones that sometimes grow because of political machinations of one sort or another, but are generally thought to grow because of a kind of natural propensity of the faith to spread, with sort of the implicit notion that the faith appears to be superior to whatever preceded it. In other words, that it is seen as a step up. This is the bias of monotheists. They tend to say, one God is better than two, or is better than seven, or is better than 150. There's no demonstrative evidence that this is true. But there is a prejudice that monotheists have, and then, of course, you have post-religious people who feel that, hey, if we've gotten it down to one, presto change, we get that to zero, and now we've really reached the pinnacle of human achievement. Now, the question is, why does a religion grow? And does a religion grow in a way that is particular to the fact that it is a religion, or does the growth of a religion represent simply one example of a type of growth phenomenon that could apply to other things? The answer you get to this depends a lot on what you take to be evidence. And this is where I'm going to belabor a certain point in this lecture, because I've written a book on conversion to Islam in the medieval period, entitled Conversion to Islam in the Medieval Period. And I'm going to lay out for you the thinking that went behind that book, because the argument of the book is that the spread of Islam is representative of the spread of all sorts of things, that it is not specific to Islam, it is not specific to a religion, it is not even specific to an intellectual or spiritual trend, but it is rather a sort of a special category of the spread of all sorts of new things. And it really gets into the question of how do things come to be known and how do they spread? The general topic, keyword in this, is the word diffusion, which I've brought up in an earlier lecture, talking about the problematic aspects of diffusionist thinking. And how do you, because something appears here and previously it appeared over here, is it plausible to think that it spread from here to there? Now, in the case of, let us say, domestic pigs, you have wild pigs occur in many parts of the world. You have domestic pigs showing up in the Malay Peninsula and in southeastern Europe. Pigs don't run very fast. They get tired if they have to walk a long way. So the idea that somebody domesticated pigs in Vietnam and then trotted them off to Romania is not very plausible. And yet you have people who will say, well, pigs were first domesticated in a certain place and the practice spread from there. And so we say, okay, that sort of diffusion theory is somewhat weak because we have equally plausible scenarios by which you would have independent genesis of some new tendency. On the other hand, if it was known from archaeological evidence that there were no wild pigs in Romania, and that the only place wild pigs ever occurred was Malaysia, then you would have to say, well, yes, those pigs must have been marched off to Romania. And you think, well, that's sort of bizarre. Except what we do know is that all the chickens in the world come from the Malay Peninsula. That is where the only place where the jungle fowl, from which the chicken, as we know it, emerges as a domestic animal, that's where it exists as a wild bird. So it is possible to have worldwide distribution from a single point. It's also possible to have parallel invention or parallel development. And the test for any diffusion theory is the plausibility of scenario A over scenario B. Now, in the case of a religion, nobody would argue that Buddha lived in two different places and that you had, Buddha in northern India in 500 BC and another guy with the same name and the same biography who lived in China in 100 BC. Same thing with Islam. I mean, certain things start at certain places. So when you come to the spread of religion, diffusion is an appropriate keyword instead of being a problematic keyword. It has to spread from someplace. So what we're dealing here with is not the fact of, not the question of whether you have diffusion, but more the mechanics by which this diffusion occurred. Now there has been too little study of the history of the spread of religions. There are various reasons for this. I was once invited to speak at a conference on traditional Christian communities in the Islamic world, and I wrote back and I said, I don't really work on traditional Christian communities. He said, yeah, but you work on conversion. And these are communities that disappeared because the people became Muslims. So I went to the conference, and it was about this time of year, and I remember I was in Toronto at the Pontifical Institute there, getting up in the morning, going to breakfast, and everyone saying, good morning, Father. Good morning, brother. Good morning, Father. Good morning, Father. How are you today, Father? How are you, Reverend? And I was saying, does anyone know who won the World Series last night? And they said, what's the World Series? The study of conversion is often, or for a long time was considered, the preserve of people of faith. Usually people of faith who were either on the winning or the losing side. And you had an interesting pathology that accompanied that, which was a kind of schizophrenia, in which, if Father so-and-so was talking about the loss of Christian souls to Islam, he would usually be a Marxist. He would say the Muslims had jobs, they had money, they handed out goodies, there was a tax break, and those people who left our faith left for financial, worldly pelf. And then if you talked about people who joined that Christian community, suddenly they switched from being Marxist to being spiritualists. Jesus appeared in the heart of the believer and called them to the faith, and the person who had not previously been a Christian said, I will take Jesus as my Savior and convert to Christianity. So you had a problem that people with deep faith commitments had conflicted feelings when they talked about change of religion. Now, you might think this business of Jesus appearing in the heart would be sort of silly, but I was once at a meeting of missionaries in Tehran, and there was a missionary there, a Protestant from Azerbaijan, from Tabriz. And he said that they had taken a survey of all of the converts from Islam to Christianity within the orbit of the Protestant mission in Tabriz, and they had to find out why they had converted to Christianity. And it turned out that every single one of them had converted for the same reason, that Jesus had appeared in a dream. Not a single one converted because they were hired to be a chauffeur for the mission. They just happened to get that job otherwise. Not a single one had converted to be a cook in the mission guest house. It was always that Jesus appeared in a dream. And of course, I sort of raise a question. I say, this is a typical Islamic thing, where, Muhammad or some saintly person appears in a dream, and thinking I was making a important contribution, and the missionary said, Jesus appears in all of our dreams. I thought, okay. I guess I'm not quite on the same page, and so I dropped out of the debate quite quickly. But it really has been the case that the assumption of people joining the faith has been attributed to, let us say, charisma, to make it more general. And the subject of people leaving the faith, has often been attributed to worldly gain. The charisma is studied usually through the lives of missionaries, where the deeds of a saintly person, whether it's a Christian missionary of the Protestant ilk that we have now, whether it's a saint from the early days of the Christian church, whether it is a Buddhist monk who travels to faraway places, or whether it is a Muslim Sufi who goes off into the wilds. The story of these missionaries, to use a very general term, is often illuminated by instances of charisma, of miracles, or saying things that suddenly transform the world for the listeners, kind of Sermon of the Mount-ish type things. And then the study of the other side, of the loss of the faith, is often involved with financial issues, changes in tax levels or duties or jobs available, things of that sort. Now, I don't believe that this is a competent way to study religious change. At least it is not a way that I find persuasive, because it is anecdotal, it is dependent upon sources that are manifestly doctored to serve a particular interest, and because it says very little about things that would affect the ordinary people's lives. It tends to deal with the elite, particularly when you something like, who was the first person to bring the Lotus Sutra to China? Say, oh, it was so-and-so, the great pilgrim. He brings the Lotus Sutra, and you think, you're bringing the Lotus Sutra, this great Buddhist text, to a country that is mostly illiterate. Well, who exactly read the Lotus Sutra? That's more important than who brought it. So I pursued a different line, and I said, can you find a way of determining when a particular family converted from one religion to another? And for Iran, in the Islamic period, I argued that this was possible, because we had very large quantities of biographical material about individuals. The biographies said nothing about conversion, but the biographies typically contained a genealogy. And the genealogy would say A is the son of B, is the son of C, is the son of D. And because it was in Iran, where the language of Islam was Arabic, but the native language was Persian, you would find genealogies that would go Arabic name, the son of Arabic name, the son of Arabic name, the son of Persian name, with this being a variable number of generations. You didn't have any names past this, typically. You would just go back to one Persian name, as if the family had started over at that point, with no further genealogy to pursue. So I hypothesized. I said, let us say that this is the person who converted to Islam, or possibly he converted to Islam or he's the father of the one who converted to Islam. And anyway, let's say that that's the time, the point in that family's genealogy where conversion took place. Now, since let's say if you have a date of the life of this person, then you count the number of generations going back, and you multiply by a standard figure for the length of a generation. And you can deduce, or induce, you can determine the average length of a generation by taking a large number of samples in which you know the death date of a father and the death date of a son, and you can subtract the former from the latter, and you discover how long was the gap between a person's being born and the death of his father. When you do that, you get a number of about 35 years. Now that seems too old in the sense that we think of people having siring children somewhat younger, but you have to allow for the fact that that with plural marriage, a man at that period could sire children over a substantial sequence of years, and that the 35 would be the midpoint of that sequence. The youngest child might have been sired when he was 25, the oldest when he was 50 or something like that. But in any case, it's simply a standard term used for the length of a generation. But if you do that, if you say, here's the time of this person's life, then you can say, let's say this is the time of the second person's life, the time of the third person's life, that's the time of the person who converted to Islam. It's clearly an approximation. All generations not the same length. We don't have data about these individuals other than the first one. All we have is a name. Mark Twain, in his book on life in the Mississippi, has a wonderful line where he says, science is so wonderful. You reap such a harvest of conjecture for such a tiny input of fact. But if you have a large number of genealogies that fit this pattern, let's say, 400 or 500 genealogies that follow an AAP pattern, then you can look at the time for the purported date of conversion, and you can add up those times and distribute them over a time scale. So let's say here is a time scale that goes, in the case of Islam, it would go from, say, 622, the beginning of the Islamic calendar, up as far as you want to go. For Christianity, it would start at 0, go up as far as you want to go. For Buddhism, let's say it starts at 500 B.C.E., goes up as far as you want to go. You know the point of genesis of the religion. If it's a religion that is going to another place, it may be that what you know is the first instance of the religion in that place, rather than the first occurrence. So there's a general agreement that the first Buddhist known to have come from China to China from India and to have brought with him a knowledge of the Buddhist faith, lives somewhere around 65 CE, which is just about the beginning of when the term Christian comes first to be used for the followers of Jesus. So this is the synchrony you get between Buddhism in China and Buddhism in the Roman Empire, even though Buddhism is much older in India. Now, if you add all of these dates, what you get is a curve like that. And this is known to statisticians as a logistic curve. What it is the integral of a bell-shaped standard distribution curve. That is to say that if you were to add everything in T1 to everything in T2 to everything in T3, you wouldn't get it tapering off because you're adding everything, and so it adds up to an S-shaped curve, the logistic curve. Now, the fact that this is related to a standard distribution curve is suggestive. It suggests that there is probability involved. In other words, the whole point of a standard distribution curve is that things are at their greatest level of probability at the peak of the curve, and as you move down either arm, it becomes less and less probable. And you measure this probability by standard deviation. So this would be one standard deviation from the mean on one side, one standard on the other side, and so forth. We don't have to go into that right now. But the point is that when it turned out that the real data I was using from genealogies fit this curve, it was a very, very suggestive finding. But it wasn't suggestive to me because I had never heard of a logistic curve. I was teaching at Berkeley at the time. I gave a talk about what I was finding about genealogies. I drew this curve, and afterwards a geographer in the audience said, well, that's a very interesting use of the logistic curve. And I said, well, let me write down this word logistic, and where can I find out something about it? Because I had never heard of a logistic curve, and I knew nothing about statistics. I ended up having to go to the library and check out a couple of textbooks on statistics and teach myself something about it. But it turned out that the logistic curve was not only a known way of looking at the distribution of something, but it was used over and over and over and over again to study diffusion. All sorts of things have been measured in their diffusion of popularity by logistic curves. Indeed, it is a pillar of the marketing science industry. To predict the rate and to try and influence the rate of spread of a new product. It has literally been used thousands of times in the 20th century to model the actual rate of diffusion of something and to predict the probable rate of diffusion of something because it is such a reliable instrument. It's used by epidemiologists in a somewhat different way, used by demographers in a somewhat different way, but it's one of the most common statistical instruments for the study of the spread of things in the 20th century. It's just that nobody had ever applied it to the study of religion. So I thought, is it possible that the adoption of religion is like the adoption of hybrid corn? That it is something that spreads by the same quantifiable pattern that would be applied to instances of technological innovation. When I actually sent my book into a publisher, they sent it to a professional, a professorial reviewer who wrote back a review saying that it is so insulting for somebody to apply marketing theory to religion that this book should never be published. And I had to go through the letter, the scathing review, and I broke it down into 36 specific hostile arguments. Then I had to go through and refute every one of them, largely on the basis of what was in the book. I said, well, if this reviewer had read page 26, he would have realized that I already responded to that. Or if he read page 42, he would have realized I already responded to that. But he hated it. Because, as I said, people who are interested in conversion tend to be people of faith. And people who are interested in diffusion tend to be people who are interested in things. And the question, the relationship of things to faith, is a vexed one. Nevertheless, the data were clear. I had a genuine logistic curve derived directly from empirical data preserved in medieval sources. And I was going to go with my data and then see what I could get out of the coincidence between the curve I derived empirically and the theories involved with the curve. Now, it turns out there's fundamentally one underlying theory, and it is the theory that unites the world of faith, or the world of the intellect, and the world of things, and that is communication. Because fundamentally what this is a curve based on the dissemination of information. You start out with a handful of people who contact a somewhat larger handful of people and convince some subset of them to adopt a new thing, whether it's hybrid corn or a new faith. Those people contact others, persuade a few of them to adopt something new, and you get what in physics you would call a chain reaction, where each generation produces a larger base than the one before, and that produces a large number of converts, and then once you get to the 50% point, it diminishes because you've saturated the audience. For example, if you're converting people, here in the beginning, you have plenty of pagans around. You cross the street and you run into 15 pagans. But by the time you get to here, you can't find a pagan because almost everybody is converted. But the same thing would apply if you were adopting a new, hybrid corn. To begin with, nobody's using it. Then a few people use it, and then pretty soon everybody's using it. So it seemed to me that at the level of communication theory, this made a great deal of sense. But it challenged the hypothesis that charisma is at the center of conversion. Because it's just, particularly if you're talking about pre-literate societies in which there is no way of amplifying the voice or recording the voice, there is simply a physical limit to how many people a missionary could have come into contact with. And so if the Christians say St. Willibrord went to Frisia and the Frisians converted to Christianity under his guidance, you think, well, how many Frisians actually sold St. Willibrord? Or is this simply a shorthand saying he was the first and then it proceeded by other processes? What would the other processes be? Now, if you break it down to the question of communication, then you look into the literature on innovation diffusion in the 20th century, particularly at the marketing end of it, and you find that there's a great deal of study of why do people adopt something new. It's a rather sophisticated view. say right now, if you go to Hulu to look at a TV show and an ad will show up, sometimes at the top it'll say, would you rather see an ad based on a testimonial, or would you rather see an ad based on scientific evidence or something? They're still trying to decide what it is that makes people adopt things. The most common view, I think it's still the most common view, is that people adopt things because someone they know has adopted it. Not someone they know simply casually. It's not because the doorman in the building has adopted it. It's because the adoption has been made by someone they know and esteem, that they know and trust. This is why you have thousands of television advertisements that are mini dramas of this model of adoption, where someone's, a woman comes into the kitchen and says, Veronica, how do you get George's underwear so clean? Says, well, Mom, I use New Blue Cheer, usually holding it on her shoulder, which is not the place most people will hold a new product, but it's the one that gets the two-shot between the product and the face of the adopter. Says, oh, that's wonderful, I'll use New Blue Cheer. Or, I am a pharmacist, and when I have a problem with erectile dysfunction, I take Cialis. You're supposed to trust it. Now you know that he's not a pharmacist. And you know that that was not a mother-in-law and a daughter-in-law talking. You know that it is a completely fictional drama written by an ad person, but it is intended to model the status relations that are felt to be the most influential factors in causing people to adopt new things. Which leads to the question of, do people adopt new religions because of a charismatic figure that they've heard about, perhaps even seen once, or because someone they know has adopted it? The suggestion of the logistic curve is that it is the spread of communication, the spread of information, rather than the fortuitous encounter with a saintly figure or a missionary that is the crucial thing. That people move into a faith community from their old faith community because they know someone who has already done it. Very likely a family member or someone who is a leader in the community. We can even find examples that sort of suggest that people knew this, where you'll have the son of a religious figure, or perhaps of a royal family, who's targeted for conversion on the grounds that, well, if the son of the bishop converted to Islam, then that must be a good thing and I'll convert to Islam. Or if the prince has adopted Christianity, I should adopt Christianity because we revere that. So it's all affected by the social structure and the status relations that you have within the particular society that you're dealing with. The likelihood is that this kind of curve works better for pre-modern intellectual tendencies than modern ones, simply because printing and then electronic dissemination of information make the whole timetable of the spread of information so much faster that it's harder to pin it down. But when you're safely ensconced in the late ancient world, you know that you're dealing with something where communication simply can't be very fast. You also have the complication that it's very hard to learn about something new from someone who does not tell you about it in your own language. So another factor here is, what are the languages that are in use? And when do you first have people who are able to communicate in the language of the target audience as opposed to the initial language of the faith? For Islam, it's a question of, since Arabic was only spoken in the Arabian Peninsula and along the desert fringes north of Arabia, most of the areas that the Arabs spread into did not speak Arabic. So how could Islam spread through communication if the people who were the Muslims couldn't speak the language of the people who were the potential converts? For Christianity, we assume that Aramaic was the language of the earliest community, and probably St. Peter and the disciples who remained in Jerusalem after the crucifixion, they were probably primarily Aramaic speakers. Now you think of Paul. Paul spoke Greek. Some of the other disciples spoke Greek as well and have Greek names. But you have to assume that for those people who were Greek speakers, encountering a Aramaic-speaking missionary would have done no good. Now you can say, well, okay, let's look at translations. But again, there you have the problem that that presumes a literacy. And most people were not literate. So when you look at the spread of information, you have to look at the status relations in the society, who is likely to have been sources of emulation for people who are joining a new religion, and you have to look at the means of communication. It's one thing to have a missionary come from a foreign land, but if he doesn't speak your language, it doesn't do a whole lot of good. Now what I'm leaving out here is the particular religion appealing? Now, so much of the study of the spread of faith is focused on the doctrines rather than on the process. That in many cases the doctrines seem to have been overread, in the sense that too much has been read into issues of doctrine. For example, you'll find many Christian writers who say that Islam spreads in Africa because Islam permits plural marriage and African men like to have a lot of women. That's basically racist. I think even beyond basically, I think it's explicitly racist. But that's passed as scholarly wisdom in lots of books. And it's highly implausible unless you actually have data that relate to the frequency of plural marriage and so forth and so on. All men cannot have numerous wives. There aren't enough women. For every man that has numerous wives, there's some poor guy who's kind of, hanging out by himself in his bedroom at night and, not enjoying that particular privilege. So doctrines tend to be overread, but more importantly, what constitutes the doctrine is a variable. And to me, this was one of the most striking conjectures that I drew from the itty-bitty bit of information I actually had about Islam and conversion. And that was that what Islam was changed as a function of the dissemination of the information and the growth of the community, and what the religions were from which people were converting to Islam, that changed as well. And this has to do with the sense of whether you are in a minority or whether you're in a majority. when people study this kind of curve in talking about innovation and diffusion in the 20th century, in other words, when they're looking at how something becomes popular, what they do is they divide it divide the curve into segments. The curve inflects at the 50% point and becomes symmetrical on either side of it. And the divisions, as I mentioned, are divisions according to standard deviation. 1, 2, 3, 4 standard deviations to the left or to the right of the mean. Now, what this means is it has to do with probability. In other words, it is phenomenally improbable that anyone was going to adopt the religion at this point, because the religion was barely known. The chances of you actually encountering someone who could explain it to you in your own language were very slim. But then it starts to grow, and you have a few more, and then you get a bandwagon effect. Over the period from one standard deviation to the left to one standard deviation to the right of the mean, you have a massive amount of conversion, or a massive amount of adoption of a new process or a new product. Modernization theorists give names to these categories: pioneers, change agents, etc. Because what they're trying to do is to identify social categories that have the highest or the lowest propensity to adopt something new, the highest or the lowest likelihood of being persuaded to do something new. And you think, well, how can you do that? How can you guess who is likely to do something new? Well, one thing you can guess at is that, if you're real old, you're probably not going to do something new. You know what you do, thank you. And, actually you don't particularly want to buy a Segway and learn how to travel on two wheels. You can't get your walker, for example, to balance on it. So that's one category. You have the category of the young, category of the old. When you look at the demographic models that you see in advertising, you can see how marketing people aim at selling to particular age cohorts. I don't have to give examples of that. It's pretty obvious. There are some things that you say, nobody sells Depends to young people. It's, there are things that are sold only to old people. But in the broader sense of how are these categories defined? In the case of adoption of a new product or process, the key has always been advantage, material return. The first people who do something are thought of as the ones who are getting the benefit, the greatest benefit. That's the reason some other people are persuaded to do what they're doing, so they see the benefit. In other words, with a new process or a new product, the change agents, the innovators, are seen as the first to take advantage of something that benefits them. They can now communicate more easily because they have a 4G phone, or they can travel easier. They can jump higher because they have a new running shoe that is balanced on helium balloons or something. There's an advantage. Now, the advantage diminishes as you work up the scale, because pretty soon everybody has the same advantage. But at the innovative stage, that can be important. In other words, the first person with hybrid corn may have a larger crop and sell it for more money, and he gets rich. So the model of innovation diffusion when it comes to the material world has tended to be that the people who adopt something first are youngish people who are well educated, who have the resources to risk making a mistake, who have the social contacts for them to hear about something new, and they get substantial rewards for having been in first on a new trend. This is paralleled by other people who are poor, have few resources, are out of touch, have little information, and they are the laggards. They're the ones who are going to come along at the end of the curve. So the big takeaway lesson of innovation diffusion in the 20th century has been the rich get rich and the poor get poorer. No big surprise, we already knew that. Now, you take it over to ideological change, in this case, religion, to become a Buddhist, to become a Christian, to become a Muslim. Is there a real world advantage? Doctrinally, you could say to become a Christian or become a Muslim, less so to become a Buddhist, means that your chance of going to paradise is increased. But you know, that's a long shot. You really don't know about the payoff until it's too late to change your mind. You know, you die, you go to heaven, you hope, or you see heaven from outside the gate, and you say, oh my God, they're talking Hebrew. You know, what a mistake. I learned Latin, or I speak Arabic, and you realize you made a mistake. So even though you have religions that are salvational, the salvation is a gamble rather than a sure thing. Economic payoff, yes, absolutely. There's certainly cases where there's an economic payoff, but that payoff tends to be to people who are poor rather than people who are rich. It's different from the payoff from material innovation, because typically the financial benefits by people who convert to a new religion are best realized by people who come in at a service level. Now, they come in as cooks or drivers or something like that. There's no easy way to come in as a bishop, unless, of course, you're already a Roman senator. Then you can convert and become a bishop right away. So in some cases, the rich do get richer. It may be that there are circumstances in which you enter the new religion because you're compelled. There is a battle, you lose, you survive, now you are a slave. And then you're told, oh, in this faith, if you convert to the new religion, you'll be freed and you'll no longer be a slave. Of course, you'll still have to work for your former master all your days. You'll be his client, but nevertheless, you'll not be a slave. So sometimes you have material advantages. If it's a conquering situation, it may be that if you join the army that just defeated you, and that army goes on to win other victories, you will share in the loot that is gained in other victories. So there may be material advantages of that sort. You have to look at specific cases and see how they work. But on the whole, when you look at populations globally, instead of at very specific groups such as those who are in combat situations or slavery situations or situations where they move from one elite status to another, it's hard to generalize in this way. I use two things that I call axioms to try and make sense of what happens when people change religious faith. And there may be others. These are two that have occurred to me, and I call them axioms because I can't possibly defend them. And if somebody wants to write a paper refuting them, that's just fine. But one of them is that no one voluntarily converts from religion A to religion B if, by conversion, he or she markedly lowers his social status. If you have a religion of slaves and the emperor converts to it, the emperor does not become a slave, but it now becomes a religion of emperors. People do not trade down in the area of religion. Now, what they consider to be trading up can vary. In other words, you may feel you're trading up if you join the religion of a new ruling group, but you also may feel you are trading up if you join a religion that has a written scripture and religious edifices of some sort, and you're moving from a sort of an unscripture, pre-literate tribal faith to something more sophisticated. Your notion of what is making it better can be a variable. The second axiom is that people who change religion generally have the same expectations of religion or the same hopes of what their religion may produce for them in the new religion that they had in the old religion. In other words, people are not really reborn in a new religion. Rather, they bring their hopes and their expectations from the old religion to the new religion. So that if you come from a religion that has say a panoply of ritual activities, you'll expect a panoply of ritual activities. If you come from a religion that has an elaborated legal system, you'll expect a legal system. If you come from a religion that has an authority structure so that everybody knows who is the bishop or who is the abbot of the monastery, then you will expect to have that kind of authority structure. It also means that when you have new religions, say the case of Islam, or for that matter the case of Christianity, the case of Buddhism in China, it means that when people enter the religion, entering with them is a large corpus of belief and tradition and societal and institutional expectation that they had in their previous religion. And that changes the religion to which they're converting. So if you have a religion that has no law and is practiced by 50,000 conquerors, and you move down the line, and pretty soon you have the descendants of those 50,000 conquerors plus 4 million converts who have converted from a faith background that has an elaborate law system. The religion of those initial 50,000 will produce a legal system because the converts want a legal system. They will demand a legal system. And this is the reason the religion changes over time. You also have the phenomenon, many people, when they think about religious change, think new converts are fanatics, they're zealots. But that isn't true. That is true at this end of the curve. When you have people who are standing out for their earliness in a process. It doesn't apply to people that end of the curve, who are old fogies, who are getting on a bandwagon that actually passed some time ago, and they're just kind of dragging along and getting on it. But what it means is that often a new religion has to have something that appeals to people who are religiously zealous and who find their existing religion unsatisfactory. I want to be saved, and Christianity isn't doing it for me, so I'll join Islam and get saved there. Frequently, this is unsatisfactory. Someone converts, someone who's really zealous, converts from one religion to another, stays in that religion for a while, and then converts on to a third religion or to a fourth religion. These people are what I call serial converts. What they like is the emotional charge they get each time they convert. Each time they think, now it's the real thing. And oddly enough, the model of the serial convert is St. Augustine, who is so excited when he discovers Neoplatonism, and he's a Platonist. Platonism, doctrines of Plato, they explain everything in the world, but here's the Manichaean faith. So now the Manichaean faith, this dualism from Iran, this is the real deal. I'll become a Manichaean and it'll explain everything. But, actually Christianity is better, so now I'll quit being a Manichaean, I'll become a Christian. So he becomes a Christian, and then after a point he says, Christianity is fine, but wouldn't mystical Christianity be better? And I hear a small voice here in the garden, and it's God talking to me, so now I'm a mystic. Serial converts occur in many situations, but over time, they're not the ones in particular who galvanize the middle of the curve. It's ordinary people who change in the middle of the curve, and among the laggards you get very little zealotry, but the religion has to develop to provide room for dull, phlegmatic, older people to convert. It can't always be a religion of zealots. It has to adapt, so that depending on the proportion that you have in the society, the character of the religion changes. And when you look at the history of Christianity or the history of Buddhism or the history of Islam, you see these changes, and historians of religion will note phases in the history of religious communities, but they don't always they rarely associate them with changes in the dominance within the society of the believers in this faith. Now, this is a time scale, and let's say this is a percentage scale in which you're talking about the percent of the community that ever converts to the religion. There is a group at the top that consists of people who never convert. If you were in epidemiology using this curve, you would say these are the immune population that simply never can, never will catch a certain disease. In religious situations, there's always a certain percentage that never join the new religion. And it's very difficult ever to gauge how many there are. But you know that they are there. I note that Druidism has just been recognized as a legitimate religion in England. And who knew the Druids were still around? The time scale is something that can be graphed very clearly from the data, and then you can see that the logistic curve has certain mathematical properties that actually allow you to take any 2 points on the curve and generate the entire curve. You can say this curve that I had for Iran is derived from specific empirical information that I collected and massaged in a not very reliable fashion, but I produced a real curve out of real information. But then once I had the curve, I could say, all I need is 2 points on the curve, and I can generate the equation for the curve as a whole. Or, if I'm dealing with another situation where I don't have quantifiable information, if I have 2 points on a curve, I can generate the process of conversion. So a lot in this conjecture rides on the idea that the sort of the geometric expansion of information, that is to say that the communication feature is so central to the process of ideological change, in this case religious change, that we can assume that at least some cases we can postulate, let us assume that there is a logistic curve at work here. Even though we don't have empirical, quantifiable material that would prove that there's a logistic curve. Do we have 2 points? And if you have 2 points, is it legitimate to draw a curve and say, this is the rate of growth, this is the pattern of growth of, let's say, Christianity in the Roman Empire, or the pattern of growth of Buddhism in China? Now, I noted that there seems to be, a similar rate of growth of Christianity and of Buddhism. But can you actually measure it more precisely? Now, historians of Christianity have actually tried to come up with hard numbers for specific dates. And they've done it from scriptural sources and other, at least quasi-documentary sources. And they have said, in the year 200 CE, during the Roman Empire, it appears that there were 10,000 Christians in the Roman Empire. And there's almost counting noses. I mean, you go city by city, you figure out how many people were in each Christian cell, what places did you have Christianity, what places did you not. 10,000 Christians in the year 200, given a ballpark assumption that the Roman Empire had a population of about 60 million, gives you a percentage of 0.03% Christians in 200. Then other historians have said, in the year 300, which is just before Constantine declares Christianity to be the official religion of the empire, at least the part of the empire that he rules in the east, in 300 there appear to be 10% of the Roman population is Christian. That is to say, out of 60 million people, 6 million are Christians in the year 300. All right. So here, if you have 100, 200, 300, 400, 500, 600, etc. Now you have a data point here, and a data point here, and you can now write an equation that will give you the curve for the growth of Christianity in the Roman Empire. So, and you're hypothesizing it's a logistic curve, and so you end up with that. And you say, is that likely to have been the actual pattern of growth of Christianity in the Roman Empire? You don't have the data to prove it. On the other hand, you can look at it and say, does it appear to be reasonable? Does that appear to be likely? Now, when I worked on the Islamic world, that ultimately was the test. The whole theory was a heuristic one. That is to say, a theory that was meant to teach a lesson rather than to assert a truth. Now, I thought it asserted a truth, but then it was my theory. And there was absolutely no way to test it. No, I had taken a certain number of genealogies, I'd handled them a certain way, but there was no alternative quantitative measure against which to test the curve that I had produced. So I said, it's not a certainty, but can we learn something from it? And it turned out there were certain things you could learn. For example, once you pass the 50% point, the central government disappears. Because to the degree that central government was predicated on the idea of protecting Muslims in a largely non-Muslim environment, once the environment becomes all Muslim, who needs to have an army sent out from Baghdad? Before 50%, you had people who would have revolts against Islam. After 50%, people have revolts within Islam. So in many ways, the curve that I came up with that showed that the bandwagon period of conversion to Islam, at least in the East, and say Iran or in Iraq, was, say, between 200 and 300 years after the beginning of the Islamic calendar. Let's say between 200 and 300 of the Hijra. It turned out that that fit a very large array of political and institutional and doctrinal developments in the medieval Islamic world. What has happened over the years is that I'd say most historians of medieval Islam now follow the chronology that I developed, but do not adopt the methodology that produced the chronology. They say, well, it makes the most sense of anybody's chronology, but it's a screwball way of having gotten it. Well, fine. Let them carp. Now, if you do it for the Roman Empire, then what do you get? If you have a number for 200, a number for 300, you extrapolate the curve. Instead of finding that that it is between 200 and 300 years after the inception of Islam that you'll get the bandwagon period, you find that it's between 300 and 400 years in Christianity. And that in order to get pretty much to the climax of the curve for the old Roman Empire, that is to say the eastern part, instead of taking 400 years as it does with Islam later on, it takes about 600 years. Then you can start to correlate that. You could say, well, when did you have the last emperor who wanted to revive paganism? And so you have Julian the Apostate will come down around here. Because after that, challenges are not against Christianity, but they're rather within Christianity. The development of legal concerns is paralleled at similar points on the curve between Islam and Christianity. And there are numerous other things that you could look at for correlation. So this is a theory that would argue that the growth of Christianity, despite the fact that it becomes official in 300, that the growth of Christianity is greatest between 400 and 500 rather than between 0 and 300, and that therefore Christianity is a largely post the decay of the Roman Empire, particularly in the West. In the East, the empire remains more more valid. And I'll talk about that in a later lecture. Now, my guess is that this kind of logistic expansion would work for China as well. And that my guess is that even though I have no numbers for China, that it probably took, let us say, between 400 and 600 years, something parallel to what you got in Islam and Christianity, for China to become predominantly Buddhist. And that the period of the greatest growth of Buddhism was almost certainly after the fall of the Han Dynasty, which occurs in 221 CE. So then you get this question of, is there something about the end of the empire that conduces toward people finding a personal stance with respect to faith to be particularly appealing? Now, I don't know what the answer of it is, except that it is striking to my mind that today, in the midst of our globalization, you have an accompanying belief on the part of vast numbers of people that our civilization is falling apart very rapidly, and you have an enormous growth in various parts of the world in highly personalized commitments to faith. And you just have to wonder, is this a broad phenomenon in which there is a relationship between a highly personalized faith and a sense of decay or chaos besetting the primary institutions of society, or is this simply a curious way to end a lecture?